We spent the afternoon on Wednesday, I suppose, identifying broad terms of reference for what it is that we need to talk about here. So that initial conversation where we asked people, can the tool of the masters ever liberate the oppressed, was a useful way to begin to unpack some of the themes that would emerge during the course of our time together. And then what Prof. Coupe's keynote address did was to place that very nicely in a kind of broad map of understanding, a contextual map that gave us the meta-narratives for thinking about that very question. And then yesterday we spent the day from a range of vantage points considering that question again. So the vantage point of history in the morning, the vantage point of journalistic practice as it is now for Black women who are placed in newsrooms and experience relations of power and how they impact directly on their ability to practice journalism. The different kinds of ways in which people are silenced and marginalized in the session after lunch, and how one can open up spaces for people to be able to articulate their position within the conversation. And then finally, at the end of the day, we tried to pull some of those ideas together. We started putting some of those ideas together in themes. And we spoke about, again, the importance of looking back and looking forward, of history, of thinking about relations of power, of thinking of what it means to be at the center and what it means to be at the margins. Thandeka very usefully helped us summarize some of the implications of that for what we now need to go on and do this morning. So this morning's approach is very much about the kind of things that Thandeka mentions, is what do we do at universities? How are we best placed from our position within this whole landscape of colonial practice to do decolonizing work through our practice. And Thandeka spoke very eloquently about the production, how we are placed to be generative. And that's what I see our participants this morning doing, is talking about ways of being generative. We have 4 panelists for our first session who will speak on their practice within the curriculum and how language and community engagement gives opportunities for decolonial practice. And then after tea, we will also hear from practice. Then at the very end, what I wanted you to know now is that as the very last exercise that we will do before we close, is we will have another go around, as we did in the very first half an hour on Wednesday afternoon after lunch. I asked people at that stage to say, how do you locate yourself in this debate that our own students set for ourselves in that show they did on Tuesday about can the tools of the master be can ever liberate the oppressed? I want you to consider a question again, this time to talk about, when you think about what it is that we present this morning, what do you take away with you about your own practices in your spaces? What is it that you can go away and experiment with next year in 2023 in terms of decolonial practice? Where are the ideas that are useful to you that you would like to put into practice? So if you can keep in mind that that is the question I would like to ask at the end of this morning as we listen and talk through the presentations that we will start now. Okay. So I thought we'd start with Kyaleboga first. So and then we will go to Pelali, and then finally to Linda and Rod. So in that order, each of you've got 15 minutes, and it's 15 minutes for Rod and 15 minutes for Linda. So we've got an hour, and then we've got half an hour for discussion after that. And I suppose, broadly speaking, what all our panelists are talking to us about now is ways of engagement, and also how language and communication forms a site on which decoloniality needs to be put into practice. So, Kyaleboga, I'll hand over straight to you to start us with that conversation.
All right. Thank you very much, Jen. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Kyaleboga Aiseng. Hello, guys there.
No.
I asked Colin or Tyron to share my presentation on my behalf because I'm unable to do that from here. I'm a lecturer in the School of Journalism and Media Studies, teaching courses on popular culture, media studies, African popular culture to be specific. With that being said, I'm not sure that the presentation has been shared yet because, okay, I'm starting to see the screen. Yes, perfect, thank you. Colleagues, we find ourselves in an interesting time where we need to talk about the role of the media in society. We're celebrating media freedom. We're celebrating the liberation of the press. And that on its own is a great significance to all of us that are involved in the media, because it reminds us that the media is a very important institution in our society that cannot be disputed by anyone. But we need to also understand that the press has some social, political, and economic responsibilities in the society. Needs to play that role, but it is not untouchable. We need to hold it accountable. We need to understand the manner or the ways through which it plays its social and political responsibilities. And for that, I want to focus on language because that is my specialization. I want to focus on the language issues in the media, because it is through language that we become who we are. Once someone takes away your language, they've destroyed who you are. If we remember in the works of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he focuses a lot on decolonizing language. And in this presentation, I want to focus on language matters in South African journalism, just briefly to look at how we can decolonize post-colonialism and post-apartheid journalism in South Africa. And I want to use the works of Frantz Fanon as a theoretical framework to understanding that. If I may go to the next slide, then we'll continue. Colleagues, language is a very important or an emotive issue in South Africa. We come from a dark history where language was used to include and exclude, where language was used to marginalize, where language was used to empower and disempower. The Afrikaners suffered a great deal of oppression or linguistic oppression under the British colonialism. At one point, their language was called, what they said, it was a kombuistab, or a kitchen language, a language that you used to communicate with animals. Not a language, it was not regarded as a language for human beings. The natives, on the other hand, it was double. They suffered it under the British colonialism, and the apartheid government came in and put the last nail on that coffin of oppression. Language was used to separate and to segregate. Language was also used to build the apartheid and Afrikaner nationalism. It was used to maintain the political status quo. These are the linguistic or language matters that we need to be aware of in South Africa. So in this presentation, I want us to think about the kind of journalism that post-apartheid South Africa envisions. What type of journalism do we want to produce? Is it the one that Fanon says it can lead to false decolonization? Or is it the one that can combat and fight and be for the people? Is it the one that can speak in a language that the people will understand? Is it the one that will include everyone, will be inclusive? Is it the one that will reflect South Africa, communicate to South Africans in a language that South Africans will understand and not care about anyone else? These are issues that I want us to pay attention to. You may go to the next slide for me, please. And the framework that I said I'll use is Fanonism. Some of you, or majority of you, might be familiar with the works of Frantz Fanon, an anti-colonial liberalist that was very, very involved in issues of decolonizing Africa. So Fanonism, we use it as a Marxist theory to critique works of art, to critique popular culture, to unearth racial, sexist, patriarchal, xenophobic issues in the works of art. We use it to deconstruct African studies, to unpack the underlying messages and meaning in the African text. So that's what we'll be using today to just unpack a little bit the issues that I'll be dealing with. Next slide, please. Now, in order for me to understand the nature of decolonizing South African journalism post-apartheid, I tracked journalism in South Africa from 1994 to today with some assumptions about the future, of course. I divided this period into 3 periods, or what Fanon will call stages of the national culture, post-colonialism. So I wanted to look at what journalism in South Africa has been like from language perspective, from 1994 to 2005, to 2004, then 2005 to present, then from present to the future. I wanted to understand the journey that we have traveled post-apartheid South Africa, or post-apartheid South African journalism, from language perspectives. Which languages do we speak there when we talk about journalism? When you listen to the news, what do you hear as a South African? When you read the newspapers and so forth. So Fanon, or Fanonism, developed 3 stages for unpacking national culture. This was greatly used in literature, in cinema, and so forth. Haven't come across a study that applied the same principles in journalism. So Fanon says, in post-colonialism, there is a first stage. After we've defeated colonialism, after we've defeated the white oppressors, there is a first stage that we deal with. And the intellectuals, or the intelligentsia in post-colonialism, at this stage, they still assimilate to the culture of the master. Fanon says, in post-colonialism, you have the works of art that still reflects greatly colonial influences. When you look at these works of art, according to Fanon, you can see a significant influence of colonialism. He calls this stage the period of the unqualified assimilation. There is no difference between us and those that colonized us. That is the works of art according to Fanon. When you go to the next slide, now I use this framework, this stage, to understand post-apartheid journalism. Now, after 1994, we had a lot of publications, newspaper publications, and I focus on national publications, the one that could be seen or accessed across the country. When we look at these publications, we have Beeld, Die Burger, Sowetan, The Star, City Press, Mail and Guardian, Rapport, and I'm sure there were many others. What is the trend that we see here, if we remember Fanon's argument of the unqualified assimilation, is that only English and Afrikaans dominated the market during this period. Remember, this is the period when the Black government came into power, meaning we had defeated colonialism, and now we had just defeated another form of colonialism, apartheid. But the 2 colonial languages still dominated. our presses. The issue of Afrikaans, whether we regard it as an African language or not, it's a topic for another day. But at the moment here, I'm focusing on it as a colonial language on the basis that it had great influences from Dutch, German, and all those other things. Even though it only emerged in South Africa, it's not spoken anywhere else in the world, but it's a conversation for another day. During this period, there were no indigenous languages used in the newspapers. You go back to issues of assimilation. Fanon says, we've assimilated. We've adopted the culture of the white master. There was nothing at this point that reflected us, that we have transformed our industry. Yes, there was a little bit of transformation, especially in the staffing profile of the newsrooms. There are minor changes in ownership patterns also. But Fanon says, in the first phase, the colonized intellectual proves he has assimilated the colonizer's culture. At this point, we proved that we had assimilated, we have adopted the colonizer's culture. And what was that colonizer's culture? The dominance of English and Afrikaans, which is what the British did with English, the Afrikaners did with apartheid government. Let's go to the next slide, where now we focus on the second stage. Now, Fanon argues that as time goes by, we start to wake up. We start to realize who and what we are. We start to remember the past. We remember where we come from. And that is the return to the source stage, or the return to the source phase. At this point, the native is disturbed. The native is disturbed. He decides to remember what he is. He starts to remember the past. He starts to remember how he was brought up. In this case, the native starts to remember his languages, start to remember the oppression that his languages or her languages went through. As I said, the native wakes up. So now he goes back to the past. He goes back to his childhood. The next slide now shows us what happened in South Africa, 2005 to the present. Then here I focus on regional publications, publications that you would find in certain places. There was a major change that we noticed here. There was an introduction of isiZulu as a language of publication in the newspapers. That was a great success for us as Africans. For the first time, we saw our language being used in the newspapers. That means we remembered where we are from. Our leaders started now developing language policies and implementation strategies that would enforce these changes. It is as if our leaders also woke up during that period, realized that we're in Africa, we are in South Africa. However, isiZulu is the only language that is still used in mainstream printing industry. You don't have newspapers in Tshivenda, in Chitsonga, in Ndebele, in Swati, in Sepedi. You don't have them. However, Fanon says in this remembrance stages, you will still see elements of colonialism. It is not dead, it is still there. In our case, we still see the English and Afrikaans dominance. It is still there. The two languages, the two children of colonialism are still dominant, still dominating the industry. But Fanon says that this stage symbolizes resistance. At this point, those that were colonized, they are shaken and they want to shake the system. And we realized that with the introduction of isiZulu, we managed to do something, but it's just a bit. It's not enough. But at least we managed to shake the system. Yes, we still suffer challenges of economic and political influences on the use of these languages, whereby some languages are able to succeed on the basis of their political influences and economic influences. Languages have been commercialized and commodified. That is not a South African challenge only, something that can be seen across the world. Now we go to the third stage of Frantz Fanon's work. Fanon says then there is a last stage of a colonized individual or the colonized nation, the fighting phase. At this point, the native collaborates with his or her people. In this phase, the native returns himself to awaken in the people, to produce a fighting literature, a revolutionary literature. During this phase, even languages that you would never think would make it into literature, you would find them. At this stage, Fanon argues that even when you've never come across Kalanga in the media, in the literature, you'd find it. Fanon says, even if you never read a book in the Khoi, in the San, in the Nu languages, now you'd find it. Now, the reality, the true reality of the colonized start to reflect. That's what Fanon says. This is the fighting phase where the native now is fully awakened. He's all out and he wants to destroy the mental and physical shackles of colonialism. But are we at that stage? The next slide will show us that we're still far from it. There is focal, there's nothing with that stage. We haven't reached the stage where the colonized writer in the media, in journalism, lose himself among the people. We don't see journalists now living linguistically with the people. We don't see journalists appreciating the true multilingualism of Africa and South Africa. We don't see these so-called minority languages dominating, especially in the newspapers. Yes, the SABC is doing quite a lot of work there. They are trying by all means to give isiNdebele, Swati, Xitsonga, and Tshivenda a platform there. But when we go to the printing industry, the native has not yet realized who and what he is, has not yet endorsed the everyday multilingualism of the African continent. And the next slide will show how what is missing in this third stage. News publications in more indigenous languages, it is missing. We only have one. If there is another one, I'm not aware of it. Think where I come from in the Northwest, we have two just smaller newspapers in Setswana. They don't even have funding to grow. It's just insignificant. News reporting reflecting the demographics of the country. Our country is multilingual, is multicultural, but we still don't have those things. We still struggle with journalists when they are being hired. They are given two requirements: fluency in English or Afrikaans, and another indigenous language. There is always this prioritization of fluency in English. Now, the demographics of the country will show that there are more Black people in South Africa than there are white. Last time I checked the stats, it was like that. But we still have this emphasis. And someone will say, why then are you presenting to us in English and not indigenous language? That's a question that we're struggling with. Currently, I'm at a conference where we're dealing with issues of the use of multilingualism in African universities. And all of us are presenting in English.
Keleboga, you have 2 minutes to wrap.
Thank you. Now I'm ready. One more slide to go. Just go back to the previous slide, please. That's 2 points. We haven't realized and achieved the true African multilingualism, your lines of code switching, translanguaging, and so forth. We haven't encompassed multilingualism from below, meaning how people speak on the everyday basis. We haven't encompassed those techniques in our journalism. Next slide, please. Now, in this presentation, I've tried my best to question if post-apartheid journalism has realized that identity can enable Black people of South Africa to argue, along with Frantz Fanon, that they are not a potentiality of someone else. I've argued that have Black people realized that they are not actually products, little minions of white people. They are whole as they are. And they can still prosper and to determine their identity. And the issue is that we've tried our best, but it's not enough. This is where now the arguments of decolonization and decoloniality feature in. We need to be free from racial, linguistic, cultural hierarchization. We need to destroy the asymmetrical power relations and open up challenges for Africa. We need to realize who and what we are. Thank you very much, colleagues. That is all that I have.
So we've heard from our first speaker a critique of particularly print journalism and how it measures up against Fanon's criteria for the establishment of national culture. In the remaining of the session, we will hear from panelists who are working in practice. So they're working in practice to develop their own approaches, partly to print, but also to other media within university environments that create alternatives to these mainstream spaces that Keleboga was talking about. I've asked Peladi Situsa to speak first from the Witwatersrand. And I'm just going to hand straight over to you to talk to us about what you're thinking through in terms of the curriculum on community engagement and decoloniality.
Okay. So just a few disclaimers before I start. I don't have funding from Twitter just because it's going to look like I might do. And also this paper it's still a baby. I'm still working through a lot of things. There's a lot of things I don't know yet or haven't figured out just yet. But yeah, I'm just sharing my ideas and thinking around how we can build community on spaces where some of our most dedicated followers and audience is, and see what that can do for building trust as well. Okay, I do have a presentation just to help me talk through things a little bit. All right, thanks. Okay, so I don't want to read too much, but just for my intro, I think I will just a little bit. So Twitter Spaces are social audio. It's not necessarily a podcast or just a live audio event. It can and is both, I suppose. And my fascination with Twitter Spaces, I suppose, comes from the fact that I teach podcasting, and audio is something I'm really into. And the idea that we can do it in a live and reciprocal manner is something that fascinates me. So the way journalists around the world have started to use Twitter to benefit their journalism is actually unpacking their work to a live audience. So saying, this is the report I made, or the story I wrote, or the video or short documentary I made, and this is what worked. These are the gaps that we found. Does anyone know this kind of person who can help us go forward? Or did anyone not like something? So you are starting to talk to people in a way that's more about extraction. And I think that's my preoccupation in this paper, is that we need to look at our audiences more than people who just consume something we make. And we need to more, more intentionally carve out the time and space to speak to them as people who are involved with us in trying to build a community that goes beyond, just the give and take of we write a thing, you read it, and that's the end of it. So I think link sharing in the Twitter space has become a very top-down process where, you share a link and you hope that people read it. And a lot of us don't really go into the comments to reply back. A lot of us just like things and then move on. And I've noticed with my students in particular, they're very scared to engage people. They always think people are coming to shout at them or shout at their stories or their reporting. So they don't want to engage at all, even when it's positive. And I think that's why I embarked on this project to figure out, are there spaces online that we can carve out and make more meaningful in how we engage there, and see if there are ways to improve on our journalism that way too. Okay. So trust. So trust is one of the things I look at in this paper. As we all know, we are having issues with the public trusting us as journalists. The period I look at is about 2018 to now. And in about 2018, 2019, 41% of South African surveys say they have a huge distrust for the media, particularly because they're inundated with, misinformation, fake news, and all of that. And they're not sure how to decipher what's real and what's not, based on some of the mistakes that the media makes in general. And on an everyday basis. But it does look like the pandemic helped a little bit in terms of people looking back to traditional news sources as being trustworthy. So there was an uptick in South African media in particular of about 20 to 30%, which I think is really, really positive. But I suppose we also can't hinge or hang on to the fact that only in crisis do people look back at us as a point, as a trustworthy source, right? So we have to, yes, use the moment and leverage the trust that we've gained back, but I don't think it's going to last for long, because what it tells us is that people obviously know that we're credible and that what we're doing is more accurate, but they're making a conscious choice outside of crisis not to look to us for various reasons, and those reasons are something I suppose we can explore. Right, how did we get here? Well, there are many reasons, but some of them, particularly in mainstream media, are known to all of us. So things like the SARS Rogue Unit, the decuplets debacle, the Jacques Poe matter, and something that is smaller and possibly a little bit more innocuous, I think, is the Citizen example I have there. It's the everyday mistakes that we make. So even something like that, a grammatical error, can just make someone say, I'm never spending my R5 on this again. And they're done and they're out, right? So I think we like to look at the big, the big instances of and mishaps as being the catalysts for the trust deficit. But I think it's the everyday mistakes and the, decisions made around staffing and all that kind of thing that affect the product at the end of the day. I should not call it a product in the context of it. Ethics. Sorry for that spelling mistake. So the ethics of listening is. That's why it was an elaborate joke. So the ethics of listening is a concept that Herman Wasserman speaks about, just about actually engaging with your audience in a more meaningful way. So not just, the retweets, that if I'm talking about Twitter in particular, not just retweeting or following back or liking, but actually finding out from those people what it is their concerns are, what their interests are, and not pandering to them, but considering them in your journalism, right? And I'm trying to speed along. So two things I think about or talk through are reciprocity in journalism. And I was thinking about participation at first, but a lot of the stuff I was finding was more around citizen journalism in that vein, and that's not something I'm really wanting to do. So I rather looked at reciprocity and public journalism of old. So public journalism used to be about empowering, people to make choices about their everyday lives and finding fixes to their problems and not being shy about being that person that brings the solution to them, right? Reciprocity is a little bit more complicated, but basically put, it's about making sure that there is an exchange, a mutual exchange that benefits both the audience and the journalist. So it can be a direct exchange of information, or, when people share something, knowing that along the line, someone else within our community or the journalist will come back and give me something or have something for me to use in a different way. And what I really like about the reciprocal approach is it involves your audience in the newsmaking process as someone who's not just looking or reading or watching, but someone who can be involved in meaning making in the world, which I think is important. Right, so Twitter Spaces in particular, they launched officially in about December 2020 to a number of hosts depending on their follow account, and then became available to the masses earlier this year in May. So you just need about 600 followers to be able to host a space. And when you host a space, you can invite particular people to be speakers, like on a panel with you. And then how it works is you pass a mic around. The idea of the conch kept coming up as I was writing this. Very bad idea, but that's the idea. You pass it around and whoever has the conch speaks, right? And that's where some of the equality comes in. So they can be very niche or interest-based. I mean, if you go onto your Spaces tab right now, there'll be everything from a Bitcoin chat or how to get this scholarship or it depends on who you follow, obviously, what kinds of things are going to come up on your particular Spaces feed. Nowadays, you can record and keep a Twitter space for about 90 days, which is really, really cool. So anyone who misses it can go back. But then it disappears after 90 days if you don't find another way to record and download for yourself. It does let people edit the beginning and end of their dead space. That's also a newer feature. In the South African context, obviously, we know access and data are still huge, huge problems. So expecting people, particularly people that we consider to be on the margins, to be on Twitter and then be on Twitter for 30 minutes straight or an hour straight is asking a lot. But I think there does need to be give and take on both sides. So if you're asking journalists to take out of their time to share, about their stories and their process, then I think there's a reasonable expectation that the audience also has to give something. And in our context, it's going to be money and data. So a recent paper looked at how much data Spaces uses. And it's about 30 MBs for 30 minutes, which is not bad. And 30 MBs when I last looked on my little app with my mobile providers, is 7 Rand with Telkom Mobile. 10 Rand is MTN, sorry to you guys. So around about 10 Rand for 30 minutes. So maybe people can't stay the whole time, but they can participate in a way. They can also send questions if they're not able to stay the whole time and see if those questions are answered later or not. And then in terms of language, I've noticed, so I go on a lot of Twitter spaces as a participant, host, whatever. And language, what I like about it is if you're a frequent tweeter in South African Twitter or Black Twitter or whatever, we tweet very fluidly, right? So you start a sentence in English, you finish in Spedi, there's a Xhosa word at the end, there's a Zulu something. It's a mixed match, right? And that's how people speak on Spaces. And no one ever does the translation thing. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, hard luck, and I like that. I did notice with my case study, or my most successful case study, is Hopewell Chinono. So when people speak in Shona and isiNdebele, Twitter these days with their live captions does attempt a translation. I'm told it's very bad, but I can follow, so I don't know. Okay, so I'm going right to that. My case study is Hopewell Chinono. So I first tried to look at community newspapers, in particular community publications, to see their level of engagement on Twitter. Almost non-existent for the ones I was looking at first. They don't reply, they don't retweet. It's just Blink and go, right? Then I was like, okay, let's do some mainstream publications to see what I get there. They are still doing the top-down thing. So it's just, we pick a panel of experts, they're going to talk. Thank you for joining us. What I like about Hope, so I was like, now let me look at individual journalists and see how they may be using their reach and pull in different ways. Hope has about 500,000 followers, which is great for him. And he uses that sort of brand name journalist pool that he has, I think, quite positively. So he's a hyper engaged individual, replies to as many people as he can, retweets things, starts original conversations, and obviously has the series of Twitter spaces that he does very frequently. His most attended or most successful one this year has been the one with Dr. Poppy, for obvious reasons. And I think a lot of his following is, obviously here in Zim, but also in the diaspora. So I think that's where the numbers come from. 187,000 people started listening at like minute 10 and stayed the whole time, which is amazing. And it was a very long space. I think it ran almost 2 hours. And because there was so much time and space given for, back and forth, there had to be a follow-up space for additional questions, particularly from people who had joined in. And spaces aren't perfect, right? There's going to be vitriol. There's going to be people who just come here to shout and get away with, being quite negative and I want to say evil, but yeah, like some people, there are spaces you go on and a person, as soon as they say, as a man, it's going downhill, So there are those things, or as a South African, particularly in Hopeful's ones, things are about to get bad. But I think that shouldn't overshadow the good that comes from it. And even the one with Dr. Poppy, I expected it to be a terrible time, particularly because it's happened 5 days after her viral rant. But there was so much understanding and care that she was dealt with, that she was afforded, and that people approached her with, that a genuine conversation emerged and ways forward were discussed, and like sharing of information on this is the person you can talk to about this, blah, blah, blah. So I think it lets people just take a step back and actually think about what matters to them and why, and when challenged, consider it. Not always maybe considering it in the moment, but something they can go home with. And I think that is my 15-minute stage. Yes, I'm done, and only easy question. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Melody. So I thought that was really interesting. So we hear from Kialebogo about quite a relentlessly homogenous space. And now we're hearing about the possibilities through social media to open up spaces within that in which multilingualism, amongst others, also become possible. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to go straight to our final case study and then open questions on everything right at the end. So Linda Mkaza and Rod Amner are based here at the school and are both the editors for Grauwkotz Mail, co-editors of Grauwkotz Mail. Grauwkotz Mail has now been embedded properly in the curriculum for a little bit more than a year. We started in August last year. So what they're doing in their presentation is 2 takes on what they've been able to achieve in those 12 months of time, and reflecting on that, if I can accurately summarize, perhaps. I'm not sure who would like to start, Linda or Ron. Linda, I'm going to start.
Right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Linda Mkaza, as Jacques has already explained. So basically, I'm going to speak about the social media and the language part of Grauwkotz Mail, and about community news, about news, multilingualism as a decolonial approach. So let me just rather use my phone. And journalistic approaches to the public it serves, and then Rod will elaborate on that. So basically what Grauwkotz Mail is, it's part of the journalism school, and it's got, well, this year we had 8 postgraduate diploma in journalism students, and they are basically part of that, and it's an experiential learning platform. So what happens is the students are trained here, and then they also engage with the community. So we've got an online publication in terms of the social media. We've got Grow Pots Mill Direct, social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. And then we've recently started with RMR. We've got both news bulletins and a current affairs show. So in previous years, previously it started in August 2021. It was started by Rod Amnat, the online publication, and Dr. Nix McLean. And we're just doing a continuation of the online publication because previously Grow Pots Mill was a newspaper. Awesome. So when we look at technology, the social network that is used, it depends basically on the community, or the social network site depends on the community. And I think you would assume, or I assumed, because for me, I use Twitter a lot to get my news. But for this community, we found that Facebook has actually our biggest following with over 15,000 users. And also people often converse in their home language in these community groups, both on WhatsApp, on Facebook, and those are the biggest platforms we have, because we have Grow Pots Mill Direct, for example, which is our PDF, and we get that through every Friday via WhatsApp groups. Then, similarly, if we go to community events, because we're in the Eastern Cape, the people will converse in isiXhosa, and then there's translation that is needed when we write the articles. So in most cases, previously, a lot of the articles would be written in English, but we are translating, we're trying to translate. And yes, you might think that where's Afrikaans? Because in this region, I think the main language are isiXhosa, Afrikaans, and obviously English. But because of capacity, we don't have the capacity to translate or to edit in Afrikaans. So that's why the main focus is isiXhosa. And when we look at language, it's also very important to look at culture, because you cannot separate language from culture. And especially, even though some of the journalists, for example, don't know isiXhosa, but, just having the basics and knowing how to address your elders, for example, by Mama, Dada, Sisi, Kuti, and that respect, that's given. Even going into, for example, predominantly Afrikaans speaking area, where you'd get, which is the colored area, for example, you'd be like, hey, 100, met your praat, kan jy Engels praat, can you speak English? And then when a person says yes, I'm like, oh, great, thank you. Just those basic language and understanding how to respect people in their language. So in terms of multilingualism, we have articles that are written, and we encourage people to write articles in both isiXhosa and English if they can, and to translate those. And then what we do is, now that we have the radio via RMR, we have allowed them to also have, we have 2 bulletins. The first goes in English at 2:00 on Fridays, if you want to listen in. And then the second one is in isiXhosa at 3:00. And basically that allows people to, if they miss the English one, then they can listen to the isiXhosa one, and then we can reach more community members that way. And then the current affairs show also helps us to converse, and then we can have the translanguaging and multilingualism, but most of it is in English. So, how does it all come together? So basically, because we teach the postgraduate diploma students and we serve the community, we train the journalists, and then basically language is at the center of all of this. So as I've said, not all the journalists can speak isiXhosa, but it does help. And some of them, I remember even yesterday, one of the journalists, she speaks Sesotho, and she said to me, I can't go on the story because my friend is sick, and she's the one who can actually translate for us. So it just comes to show that it's very, very important, especially in a community like ours, that journalists have at least some, linguistic knowledge of an indigenous language, and not just, I think, as Kelebocha has said, not just in passing, but maybe we should start learning to be fluent. But because the course is only a year long, it's quite difficult to kind of fit all of that in. But I do know that with the journalism degree, there is an isiXhosa course that is done, the isiXhosa for journalism, where students can write and learn isiXhosa. And then Rod, you can also chip in if you want to. Then Imingeni, so what challenges have we faced? This is not all perfect. We are still, trying to find out, find our feet. Still a baby. It's a year long. It's a year old online. And basically, some of the challenges are that we don't tell all the stories. And I think, as I've mentioned, especially in the Afrikaans community, they feel forgotten. They feel lost. They're like, we're not represented here. The colored voice is not, if I can use that term, is not heard. Even in terms of, although we are writing in isiXhosa, we haven't gone deep into the location and actually find the people's stories for the people, by the people. And so some journalists, as I've said, they don't speak isiXhosa and or Afrikaans or both. So it is quite challenging, and especially for us as editors, not being able to have an editor who can edit in Afrikaans or someone who can. But these are things that we are working through, and in future we will. And because I thought we both have 15 minutes combined, I tried to keep it short, but Rod will elaborate. So since Pelo, that comes to the end of my part of the presentation. So Ngozi, thank you, Ndiabulela. And please use the bit.ly to go to our website.
I really appreciated about what Linda did there is it shows the importance of language and of multilingualism and translanguaging in as soon as one starts talking about community engagement and the kind of transformation of news platforms. So thank you for that. So maybe just to point that out and then hand over to Rod.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Rod, and working together, we're, I suppose, trying to emphasize slightly different things in the presentation. So I'm going to try and attempt a sort of discourse analysis of a special type, I think you could call it, where we're kind of looking at not so much languages, but discourse. How is language deployed? What kinds of even within English, how is language deployed in this community? By different voices on different platforms, different social networks, different technologies or public spheres or sphericals in this community. I'm going to try and link this in a sense to different ontologies, even, I suppose you could say, or epistemologies or conceptions of who we are, what kind of democracy we want. So sort of normative assumptions about democracy and normative assumptions about the role of communication and the media within that. So that's roughly where I'm coming from. I'm going to start with yesterday. Okay, so I couldn't come to the second session yesterday because there was this big stakeholder meeting up in the monuments. So the municipality has been going through quite a tough time. Scopa and the Auditor General and COGTA have been here and have been reprimanding our local municipality. You might have noticed a bit of a water problem in town and a few other quite deep-seated problems. So the mayor stood up yesterday, the executive mayor, Yandiswa Ibabacha, and she explained the purpose of the stakeholder meeting by invoking African folklore. So I thought this was really interesting. I'm just going to read to you what she said quickly. It's in the story coming out this morning. Don't miss it, GM Direct, which will come out as soon as this is done. When a villager's grass hut leaks, the other villagers will climb onto the leaking house and give it new waterproof layers of strong grass. The primary belief was that neighbors from the same village should feel the pain of the villager whose hut had been damaged by the rain. This is Ubuntu. And she goes on, interestingly, to talk not just about the idea of a sort of communal, or communitarian, or perhaps, the quite interesting gradations here, actually. Is this collectivist? Is this communitarian? What kind of political philosophy is it Ubuntu communitarianism? Is it collectivism? It's a small village. We no longer live in small villages. We're in complex post-industrial societies. But the invocation here is that, if one of the village rondavels is leaking and is not fixed, then all of the rondavels in that village will have the same problem during the next rainy season, and the village will face dilapidation. The realization was that no stranger would come from somewhere else to fix the thatched roof. Villagers should instead observe what has happened to their fellow village and call each other to talk about how best they should assist that family. So there's also an element here of deliberation, the idea of people coming together to work out how to fix a problem. And your problem is my problem. So the front page of this week's Growcott says, your hut is my hut. Okay, so I thought it was quite nice. And then interestingly, Pedro Tabensky, who's a philosophy professor, stood up later in the meeting and he said, the best part of this meeting was the my hut is your hut thing. And he then said, he sort of took it further. He said, well, what motivates people to get onto leaking roofs? Okay, you can use the whip, like court orders to get municipality to jump on the houses. But maybe there are other ways of doing this. And what are those other ways? So he kind of got into political philosophy there a little bit, but using, the metaphors of getting on roofs. I won't elaborate too much further because I don't have a lot of time. But I thought it was a really interesting moment that there was this invocation of Ubuntu communitarianism going on in the room. And the pushback from the people in the room was, essentially a liberal pluralist accountability, transparency, you must do your jobs type of rhetoric coming from civil society, PSAM, from groups, Makanda Residents Association, groups that are monitoring, providing oversight, and so on. So there's quite a strong pushback and a different conception of democracy embedded in the discourse in that meeting. There's also quite a strong technocratic language coming from the municipalities. On one hand, the mayor, who is training, by the way, to be a Sangoma, is using African folklore and Ubuntu communitarianism as her political framework or point of reference. But the other people in the room were using quite technocratic language, quite distancing themselves, essentially, from the people, using that kind of quite opaque language. And in fact, Pedro said, I don't understand your language. I'm a philosopher. I understand metaphors about people getting on houses. Imagine if it had been a public meeting for the general public. A lot of that technocratic language, they would have been pushed back against that. And as I said, civil society had this also technocratic language, but also the language of outrage, the language of demand, the language of complaint. And a lot of that stems from, so if you look at the WhatsApp groups in the sort of suburbs of this town in Ward 4, Ward 8, what you get there is that conception of, of liberal pluralism. There's a little bit of deliberation every now and again starting to emerge there, but generally speaking, it's a discourse of complaints. The municipality is the enemy. It was written yesterday on one of those groups. Adversarialism, it's sort of Westminster democracy, accountability, transparency. We will empower ourselves as citizens and we will take down this municipality. We will force them through court orders to do the right thing and so on. And yet there was this quite impassioned plea for let us see each other's humanity. Let us think of ourselves as being maybe in a more deliberative democracy, or possibly, and this is where Mabuti Machumza, the speaker, interestingly said, there is no more, we are reborn, he said at the end of the meeting. There is no more us and them. We are all together. So the invocation there was to a corporatist democracy. All these stakeholders need to come together as one. We are facing a crisis, therefore we must drop all our differences. We must become a corporatist mini, sort of local state, if you like, and we must put aside our differences. But there's no us and them. We're all one, and that's a corporatist conception of democracy. Ayanda Kota stood up and, as a representative of the Unemployed People's Movement and the Makana Citizens Front, used more radical language. The entire system is rotten. We need to change, patterns of inequality, and we need structural change in this place and in our society. A more radical, direct democracy, conception of democracy was emerging from his lips. So in the room yesterday, we had 4 competing conceptions of democracy embedded in the discourse that was circulating. And the interesting thing is that they are then, from those different conceptions of democracy, different understandings of what the role of the press is. So I'm sitting there, like, what is my role? What my role? I'm the reporter, right? But what is our role as Grobhart's Mail? So, we're more partial in a sense to critiquing the standard hegemonic monitorial role of the media. I believe in investigative reporting and transparency and accountability. I would certainly not jettison that. But the idea of a more facilitative approach, I think, is important. There's a kind of a word there, sort of a guide dog role. But I think that's the wrong word. And I refer to another meeting I had recently where I went to City Hall and I spoke to the director of infrastructure who's in charge of water and the manager of water, who, by the way, is about to go to court in December for a pending case of 28 million rand stolen in a Free State municipality where he previously worked. But nevertheless, I walked into the room and there were 4 people there: the press officer, the director, the manager, and also the Ward 5 ward councillor, who's the chair of the portfolio committee. And for 40 minutes, they hated on me. I didn't get to ask any of my questions because they were shouting at me for being a watchdog monitorial journalist who didn't understand context and was anti-municipality, and sort of misunderstood that the questions I was bringing were actually from citizens of, are you then representing the DA? Are you politically biased, etc. So it was a very difficult and uncomfortable space, but we did get past that. But what was interesting later on in the meeting was that the Ward 5 councillor said, I asked about WhatsApp groups. I said, because we were talking about communication problems. And by the way, yesterday, that was the dominant discourse that was emerging in the stakeholder meeting yesterday. Communication, information, we are just not getting that information out there. So I was saying, well, what about WhatsApp groups? In Ward 4 and Ward 8, there are 350 people talking very loudly all day long. Why is that not happening in your ward, councillor, in Ward 5? She said, I do have a WhatsApp group. I said, fantastic. Please, can I join? By the way, how many people are on there? 10. I said, what do you mean 10? She said, well, they have 10 ward councillors. So I said, but surely you want this for the whole community. And she said, Rod, you wrote a story about E. coli in the water, and our people thought that you meant it was in their drinking water, when in fact it was about rivers, right? And our people are ignorant, she said. Our people are ignorant. And it's not a good thing to have everybody in a WhatsApp group because people don't know things, and we are the guides. So there's another conception of democracy, a fifth conception of democracy, which comes from the Soviet Union, actually. It's called democratic centralism. It was essentially developed by Lenin. The idea that the committee knows best, the advanced vanguard of the revolution. They are the people who know best, and the people are ignorant, and we must guide them and show them the way. That's a conception of democracy that I don't particularly subscribe to, so I find it difficult to accept that. And we had quite an interesting debate about political philosophy in the infrastructure department last week. But another interesting thing to emerge in that meeting was the director of infrastructure, who spoke eventually in very, very loudly and very passionately about her pain, the pain of the assumption that because she was the former CEO, by the way, of Amatola Water, and came here. She said, when we were in Amatola Water, we used to look at local government and say, oh, these people are lazy, these people are incompetent. She said, I'm here now. I know that that's not the case. I am competent. I have the qualifications. I am a good manager. The challenges that I face are multiple. And it pains me that people look at me as a Black woman and make assumptions about me. It was an extremely difficult meeting to be in, to hear that pain expressed in a journalistic encounter. I promised to do my best to represent the views of the municipality the following day in the newspaper, which I think we did. We had 4 pages of detailed reporting around the challenges that the municipality is facing. But I think what happened in that meeting was I encountered her as a human being, rather than as an adversary, it was someone I needed to extract information from. So, my worry is that, we don't have the forums for deliberation to occur. We do have common values. The mayor was invoking, a different conception of humanity and a different conception of democracy and a different conception of how we can potentially communicate with each other. There are little groups forming around the Public Service Accountability Monitors Project, WhatsApp groups where people in poorer communities are beginning to talk and are beginning. So there's a group of 70, a group of 60 people, two different groups, and they're beginning to report on community meetings. In fact, that Ward 5 meeting, there's a kind of interestingly, it's not necessarily a radical discourse, but it is a different discourse of paying attention to the detail of democracy. Locals, people on the ground, rather than being led and guided by the ward committee, are doing it for themselves. And there's a different kind of democracy potentially emergent in that kind of space. There's kind of a subaltern public sphere emergent there, a stronger, genuine citizen journalism, which really isn't happening in the way that was imagined it might happen 20 years ago. Thank you. Interestingly, in the Ward 4 WhatsApp group, it's a ward where there are quite a lot of the colored communities in that ward, but also middle-class, former white suburbs, non-racial suburbs now, but essentially a class divide. And at one point, there was no water in Scott's Farm, the sort of colored area, and the people on the other side of the ward, because they were talking to each other, realized there was a crisis and bought some JoJo tanks and sent them to the other side. And the people on that side, some of them said, thank you very much. Again, the discourse of delivery, the discourse of passive recipients of largesse from either the municipality or, in this case, empowered middle-class citizens, rich middle-class citizens. But one of the people in that area said, you know what, thanks for the tank, but actually, I would prefer it if you didn't send it. I would prefer it if my community came up with a solution to this problem, because you're simply reproducing power structures and that kind of discourse of delivery and grateful recipients. You can almost call it trickle-down patronage. You talk about trickle-down economics Liz Truss is, sort of Trussonomics. This is a kind of a state, a patronage state, where there's trickle-down patronage. I was in the car with sports reporter Chris Totobella yesterday, and he said, you know what? He was telling me about how alcohol is given to people before elections. It's just giving people trinkets and bits and pieces to keep the patronage system boiled, which I think is obviously highly, highly problematic. So it's tricky. All of this discourse is messy. I think just to go to the solution sort of side of things, I think we need more spaces for deliberative democracy where we find each other, look at what our common values are, and find potential solutions to those problems across difference. So instead of just bonded communities whinging and whining, we have these very separate bonded communities, we need bridged publics. We need those bonded groups to bridge across difference. We also need linking social capital to get us to the sources of social, economic, and political power. The other two quick points, story circles. What about story circle journalism? I was going to read a quote from Ben Okri, where he talked about, the old seers and griots around the fire, the idea of telling stories at a deeper level, finding each other's humanity. So it's not just deliberation in the rationalist, Habermasian public sphere. It's about encountering each other as human beings. And the mayor's invocation for us to do that. How do we do that? Digital storytelling. Linda is, as masters in digital storytelling. How do we bring that into Grobhart's Mail? And then lastly, the idea of immersion journalism, the idea of closeness to the people, lack of social distance. Our students come from elsewhere. They don't all speak local languages. They live on campus. They work in this building. There's massive social distance between them and the people that we ostensibly represent in the paper. So the closeness to the people idea, Herman Wasserman's idea of we cry with the people. So we have something to learn from tabloid journalism and Drum magazine. We go to jail with the people. We do stuff. We're indistinguishable. in a sense. How do we do that as a journalistic methodology?
Thank you, Rod. So I think there's very rich material to work with from all four of our panelists. What I really appreciated about these stories that were shared with us of attempts to open up spaces is what it gives to us to discuss next. I mean, I was one theme that I was struck with is this idea of community engagement. And Pelari, your point about students being scared to engage is an issue I think we need to return to, what it takes when we are working in a teaching space to try and do these things, and what exactly it is that we require of our students to be able to do, and what we need to do to support them. But then also the conversation about language. Linda spoke to us about language in the kind of basic sense of the word of the languages of the Eastern Cape, but Rod took that to the next level to speak about discourses. The language of discourse and how that opens up or closes down the possibility for engagement, I suppose, and for thinking about what democracy is and what journalism does within a democracy. There was something else I wanted to say. Oh, yes. And the other thing that struck me as sort of something we should talk about is how we're talking about conversations that go on in different places. So Kaleboga was speaking about the page of the newspaper. The newspaper is an object and how language is represented there. But what our panelists have now done is also talk about all the conversations that take place around that. So there's the discussion, the conversations that take place in the field when journalists are out there gathering stories, and how language forms part of that. There are discussions that happen with audiences after publication about engagement. And there's also the conversations with the stakeholders that Rod was talking to us about, who are people who are who have a stake in the communication process. So I see that as terms of reference for our discussion now. Shall we take 3 questions as we have done in previous sessions and discuss, and then see how far we get in the remaining time? So could we have 3 questions?
I think this about the wonderful presentations. I was wondering about Peladi's presentation about Twitter Spaces. Sorry, I'm not condemning, so don't feel. So I think it's a very powerful tool. But personally, whenever I see Twitter Spaces and notifications to join, I still don't take them seriously. I still see, because I don't know if it's because of my pre-existing idea of Twitter as a place people just go and make noise. Because there are lots of Twitter is very, I don't know, very cliquey, and people are just arguing and showing that they are smart. And I try to avoid it. So, but I was thinking about the potentiality of that kind of space. How do we make it mainstream? How do we make it a serious platform? And in connection to that, how do journalists, and maybe us as researchers, how do we leverage on that kind of a platform? For example, a journalist who is working in a media organization, can they be allowed to practice that kind of public journalism, which is essential, which came out from your presentation? Can news media organizations that are very much political and they have all these other interests, can they allow their journalists to be out there in that way? And for us as media educators, is there a potential for us to use that kind of platform to engage with the wider public that where our work is embedded? So and it also points to Rod's suggestion for kind of communal journalism, that can be used to foster deliberative democracy, which we no longer have. I don't know. These are just my thinking. Maybe the question is not fully fleshed. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the interesting presentations, Colin. It's really interesting. I'm interested in the multilingualism question. And Kelly Book, I think you have very interestingly pointed out that the public broadcaster, which was funny enough, a state broadcaster and very rigid not too long ago, has become this multilingual space. And print, which is now very concerned with declines, moving online, is still very specifically at a national level embedded in certain languages. And my question with that is, where do we go from here? What are the possibilities for enlarging language capability at a national level in publications, and how do we think about that in what we do in our various spaces?
Carol has raised her hand.
Carol. Do we need to go to the speaker to?
Yes.
So
It is on.
Does that mean, please, if you could also unmute when you speak. I think you still need to unmute. I'll really well. We still can't hear you.
It's on.
Good morning.
Here you go.
Good morning, everyone. Just want to give a high five to the presenters. It's very good and informative presentations. Wanted to ask Leboga, I know there's a couple of students conducting research, master's research on African language newspapers that are failing to have much readership. Well, I know one student at the Northwest University is conducting research on isolezwe lesiXhosa ne isolezwe lesiZulu. Apparently, isolezwe lesiZulu is having is not complaining in terms of readership figures are concerned, but isolezwe lesiXhosa seems to be struggling. My question now is, how can we deal with this problem? Because I think most people support the issue of having African language newspapers and publications, but readers, some readers don't seem to be reading these publications. How can we promote community reading of these publications in their own languages? Is a multilingualism or translation of these languages back to English solution, or what would be your recommendation in this particular challenge? Thank you.
So it sounds to me that there's quite a lot of synergy between Karen's question and what Randy has just asked of Kelly Hall. So maybe we could start with Kelly Hall. Just Kelly Hall has been unmuted. There you go.
Yes, okay. Can you hear me, Jen?
You can.
All right, thank you. I think the two questions that were directed to me are interrelated. The issue that we are struggling with in South Africa and all other African countries is political will. Our governments have great policies in place to promote the use of indigenous languages, whether it's education, media, science, law, and so forth. But we lack political will. That is the one thing that we always need to be aware of. The SABC has this great language policy that promotes multilingualism. But even when you go there, there are still challenges of this hierarchization of indigenous languages. Some languages are dominating, some are just, the usage of them is minimal. We struggle a lot with the political economy of indigenous languages in South Africa. As the speaker, as the question came, said Izolezwe, the Zulu and the Xhosa one. The Xhosa one is struggling with readership. Then the question is, have we done enough to promote the use of indigenous languages in South Africa? That's where I'm going back with the issue of political will. We live in a country where a young person grows up seeing a whole president of the country doing couple of State of the Nation addresses, addressing the nation on different occasions, and they never use an indigenous language. We live in a place where there is no pride about indigenous languages that is being promoted, especially by the elites of the country. In other words, we are stigmatizing our own languages. We promote a policy, then we fail to implement. Many people don't know that in South Africa, actually, you have every right to use your language everywhere you go. They don't know that. That is because the leadership of the country is failing to promote that which they say we should do. We are a multilingual country, but in a sense, we still have English as a lingua franca. The dominance of isiZulu or the comfortability of isiZulu in the market and not struggling with these things is historical. They are the only people or the only demographic group in South Africa that has always promoted ethno-linguistic nationalism or the Zulu nationalism. On one hand, it's working for them. On the other, it's a very dangerous form of nationalism, the ethno-linguistic nationalism. But it is working for them. That is why today, they're the only culture, the only group that promotes their language, their culture at a big scale. Others, we are struggling. So even ourselves, we need to look at ourselves and say we are failing as individuals. But it's because, first of all, we are failed by the leaders to promote our languages and our Africanism. Thank you, Jack.
Thanks, Kim. And then I suppose if the panel may want to answer, I mean, Chikezi had a range of questions and comments that he made quite quickly there, and maybe I should just leave it up to you to respond to what you choose to.
On how do you take it seriously? You just do. You start joining spaces and listening and engaging. I think if you ask someone 12 years ago if journalists would be live tweeting, taking their own photos and videos or whatever in the field, like they'd laugh and say that's no, there are people whose jobs those things are and it's not the journalist. So I think we just have to be open to the possibility. I get what you mean about, you know, the kind of spaces you've seen. But I think if you're going from 0 in terms of engagement in particular to 50 dedicated people wanting to hear what you have to say, that's that the needle is moving in some way. The way I've seen it in the examples that have come up in my research as journalists using it in their everyday is they unpack their stories. So they bring a story that they've written or a podcast they've done, and they unpack it either with another journalist that they work with or from another newsroom. They talk about its merits and then open it up to the audience. And the kinds of questions that come out are often about process and how did you get this interview and whatever else. And the follow-ups are either with the guests or the experts. So I think that's valuable, particularly if we think about media literacy and how low those levels generally are, particularly in the digital space. Like we all think we know how to use these things and use them well, but we actually don't. So I think it's helpful in that regard. And then in terms of what we can do on a journal education level, so social media engagement is a mark, it's a portfolio output in my course. And the way I want to do it is maybe say next year, you have to host a space. It can be on anything, any topic. You can have as many or as little guests as you want. But that's something I can try out. And I think we shouldn't be scared of trying things out. I don't think this is a fix. It's just a way of trying to glean something different in the world. And we'll see if it works or not. It's not the answer, but it's a way forward.
I thought that point about process is a really important one. And it's one that in our school, we're also increasingly talking about, is that we should not just teach students about journalism as a product, but about what happens even after you've written a story to how you engage with audiences about that. Rod, you wanted to say something?
Well, it was a similar point. It's sort of having a more fine-grained understanding of the communicative ecology. So what are the African socialities in Makanda, for example, what are the social networks, in other words, and what are the technologies, the different platforms and spaces that people encounter each other. And those technologies, by the way, are also boot leather technologies. So people engage with each other over fences, it's understanding that people on streets, they're not just online. So it's not just about understanding the online digital networks, it's understanding people in churches and social spaces and different layers of civic life and where people encounter them, and then going to those places, and understanding how you then take a voice note in isiXhosa and put it on a very specific WhatsApp group, or even better, a Facebook Messenger group, because that's free. Well, the voice note won't be free because of the data thing, but there are ways, sort of around it. So I think it's having that sort of fine-grained understanding of, those social networks and technologies, but it's also the discourse, and the discourse also relates to journalistic genre and approach. So, and that relates to, again, what I was saying earlier about African political philosophy. So, how do we convene people in spaces? Twitter's one way of convening, but there are others that maybe emulate storytelling or perhaps facilitate storytelling better, and then if we have a recording of a rich storytelling session where people share those stories, offer that to those sorts of people who will find that valuable and interesting. And it's also, I just remember when I was a student doing a documentary in Kwaleja, and there was a moment we started the video, and for half an hour one of the community members there, was a black spot community threatened with removal. He spoke about rivers. He said there is a river called this, there's a river called... You didn't have to speak isiXhosa to understand what he was saying. We did, of course, put a translation down the bottom, but he spoke for 10 minutes. He named rivers for 10 minutes. And he said, that is our land. And it was so powerful. It was just a story, but just taking that clip, and you could share that with people who don't understand isiXhosa, they would understand the import of what was going on there, but we're not hearing those kinds of stories. We're not seeing each other's humanity through that kind of storytelling. So I think it goes back to African political philosophy. What is African sociality, as well as what are African languages? I think there are other, and what are African journalistic genres? And a fine-grained understanding of African communicative ecology in our country.
Thanks, Linda, would you like to add anything?
No, just what Galea's point on the languages and how the isiZulu, AmaZulu have developed it. I think we also just understanding that English and Afrikaans were funded, so money is needed as well and resources. So for us to actually develop the languages and the newspapers and all of that, we need to actually have the resources and the funding.
So these conversations that have to happen outside the context of journalism and media itself about language and power and how certain relations of power are maintained and need to be changed. We are at 12:30 now, which is when we were going to break for tea. But maybe I should just check if there are important questions. Saneli, do you want to speak?
Thanks, very, I think very productive, presentations. My questions are directed to the last, panelists, to Sissy and Rod. And it's really on the questions of multilingualism and also language discourse. I find them very quite interesting. But maybe the first one, I wanted more clarity on the questions of translation. I did not really get whether the stories that are conducted in isiXhosa get to be translated into English, or in the paper itself, it's got like multilingualism. And I couldn't help but think about, these newspapers that we're referring to yesterday, building up on that, on how multilingual they were. If you think about Bantu, you had Sesotho, isiXhosa, and English all in one paper, and the kinds of audiences and different publics in which these papers were circulating, and the readership that was like, went well beyond areas like your Gauteng, but also read in the Eastern Cape, and you would have these different correspondences actually and conversations between papers. You would have an article in Umtheteli responding to an issue that is written in Bantu. So I'm quite interested to pick up on that, whether when does translation kick in? And also maybe maybe hear some of your views and some of the challenges you're facing with translation itself, because translation itself has got like a lot of issues of untranslatability and things like that.
Thank you.
So that's one question. And then the last one goes to Rod on the issues of political philosophy. I couldn't help but think about, because issues of African political philosophies are very tied, as rightly you say, to language issues as well. Couldn't help but think about productive concepts like Inkundla, Khutla, there's like spaces now, the Khutla, there are thought about like deliberative spaces. And it's quite interesting when you think about those concepts in relation to also like Habermas theories of, of public spaces, and also what it may and how productive it may be to bring those in conversations, and also theorizing about, how publics are constituted or deliberative spaces are constituted in bringing these concepts also into a dialogue with these concepts of public deliberations as theorized by global not theorists like Habermas.
I will count you as two questions.
Yeah.
You also wanted to ask.
And it's been answered and it's been addressed.
Any other questions? Okay, so let's leave it at those two then. Sorry, yes.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. My question is around the multitasking. What do you make of multitasking in journalism, which ultimately makes journalists to be master of, jack of all trades, but master of none? Because now you have journalists having to shoot video, write story, shoot and edit video, take pictures, and make sure that they publish their stories on social media platforms, and also follow the agenda setters and see what's trending in order for them to develop those into story ideas. What to make of that?
So what does that require of the journalists in terms of their ability to multitask?
Sure.
Right, so those are three totally the same questions.
Okay, so in terms of the multilingualism and translation, basically we've got the GM Direct. So people, if a person writes, they can write their article in isiXhosa, and then that would be edited. And then recently we've got Chris, our sports guy, who writes his articles in both isiXhosa and in English. And then those are edited. And then the translation happens for the RMR show, which are the bulletins, where we've got the articles that were in English. They are bulleted in English, and then we have to take them and then sit and actually translate them.
So much of that's agency material that you receive in English.
Yes. So we take the articles and then we take convert them into English bulletins, and then from the English bulletins, we take that and translate it into isiXhosa bulletins. So basically the translation would happen in that regard. And I think also going into the stories, for example, especially if the community know that you speak isiXhosa, they'll make sure that the meeting is held in isiXhosa. So you'd have to listen to the audio, and then from that audio, you translate it into English. And then currently, because of the type of meeting, for example, we had on Monday, we've got students, and I encourage them to actually write both the article in both isiXhosa and English, because it dealt with a lot of cultural matters, which I thought was quite appropriate. So I hope that answers your question.
So I suppose that demands a different kind of multi-skilling as well, beyond that of media.
No, I think that the second part of the question was issues of maybe challenges.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yes, sorry, I actually. Yeah, so it is quite challenging because it's Rod and I and 8 postgraduate students. So it's quite time consuming because you have to, there's the teaching, there is the editing, there's even until recently transporting around, going on. So there's a lot, it's very demanding. And I think in terms of, the capacity, I think is the biggest challenge that we have, because you find that you actually spread quite thin. I think as Uputi has asked, jack of all trades, but master of none. But the full saying is better to have some than have none at all. So it's just that. And you find that, for example, I would love to translate an article from English to isiXhosa, but I can't. So it's better if the article is written in English. I mean, in isiXhosa, then I can edit it in that regard. But then for me, I think it's easier for me, for example, to also translate audio from isiXhosa to English. That is okay, but I think the biggest challenge is definitely the capacity and time as well, because it really is time consuming, especially with the bulletins. For example, we finished the English ones on a Friday at maybe 2 o'clock, and you've got an hour to translate. But luckily, if you're lucky enough to finish the English one beforehand, then you've got more time to translate.
You were making the point earlier about not being able to get up to Afrikaans.
Yes, and the Afrikaans, in different languages. And then we also found that there are actually apparently a community of Sesotho speakers. So one of our students speaks Sesotho, and she actually also has bulletins. I think it's now at 11. She's going to have a bulletin in Sesotho. So for the quite a large minority of speakers in Grahamstown. So while isiXhosa and Afrikaans are the main languages, we actually have a big group of Sesotho speakers. So but I think, but the students, luckily there is one who actually also speaks isiXhosa. So we work hand in hand.
Yes, well, if I could just say a little bit about that, because the other thing that worries me is the kind of formalism of news. So the idea of bulletins being translated, actually kind of, maybe we could even interrogate that. Like, what is a bulletin and why is it that way? And can we do something else with it? And can we talk about the news, for this week in more colloquial language? Can we have code switching? Can we have something that is more friendly and more exploratory and something that has more voice in it, and etc. So it's really kind of, maybe we need to explode. It's not just about translation, it's about discourse again. It's about what are the underlying assumptions of what news is in the first place and how you present it. And then can we, instead of putting PDFs every week, why do we have lots of voice notes? This story, and here's someone talking about this story. Listen to them tell you about the story, in multilingually, rather than in this kind of these old formats of hierarchies of news and upside down pyramids and all those old assumptions. I think we just need to take some explosives to all of that. And I really, thanks for the question around the idea that deliberative democracy, words like Lokotla, etc. I mean, these deliberative democracy, as the mayor pointed out, is an African invention. Deliberative democracy was invented in Africa as a matter of necessity, and communitarianism emerged, from this continent. I had a student from Malawi, though, who was trying to do deliberative work in villages, radio listener clubs, which were then sending material to Blantyre and Lilongwe. But the problem there was, the woman had to sit separately, okay, because the issues around patriarchy in that society, issues of voice, social and political power, deference to political people, deference to experts. There's a difference between respect, as you put it in the languages that we use, and deference. It's about sort of interrogating that as well as Africans. Like, what is, Mamdani says that colonialism ossified traditional leadership, structures and perverted them. Then what have we lost there? How do we excavate and recover an African democracy from pre-colonial African deliberative democracy? And how does that differ from what we see in Malawi, when my student tries to do a deliberative, event there? And also those critiques, of Habermas, the idea of bringing emotion, imagination, creativity, humanity, into deliberative spaces rather than trying to insist on a rationality, and so on. So I think there's a very rich thing that we could do there in excavating African political philosophy in that deliberative communitarian kind of frame. Yeah, and I think that work is there actually, but I don't know that it's been applied to journalism, and media studies in a way that could really show us some interesting ways forward.
Thanks, Rod. And then finally, Mankete's question about multi-skilling and multimedia.
I suppose I have a more positive outlook on that just because of how I've seen it work for me in my personal life. I think we try to train our journalists to be multimedia journalists because that's obviously what the industry demands. And we teach them to leverage those skills in different ways because journal jobs aren't guaranteed, right? Newsroom jobs. So they have to have a number of things in their toolkit so they can adapt and be agile. And that agility from my training and experience has allowed me to be a print journalist, an online editor, a videographer, a TV producer, a documentary filmmaker, a podcast producer, based on my training alone. Obviously, experience came after, but the ability to move and maneuver and be able to put up my hand in all those different spaces came from the kind of training that we do at WITS and that Rhodes does as well, exposing people to enough to be able to explore it if they want to. We do specialize in different ways in different parts of the year, but I think being a multimedia journalist is just, it's a sign of the times. There have to be that. Are journalists in industry being asked to do too much? Absolutely, but capitalism, the socioeconomic order, everyone everywhere has been asked to do too much. So it sucks, but it is what it is.
Thank you to everybody, to Keleboga, to Peladi, to Linda, and to Rod. I think that really was a very rich session. It's great to hear about these creative spaces where people are actually working constructively and discovering things. Mankete, I know that at Limpopo you're talking about the possibility of starting a multilingual news platform as well. So I'm hoping that you can connect with some of the other people here to talk a little bit about that before you go home, and maybe even now over tea.